Well, the Honourable Angus Taylor MP, Shadow Minister for Defence, welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast.
Great to be with you, Dan.
The big news yesterday was the release by the Australian government of its new emission reduction target plan. You're currently Shadow Minister for Defence, but you have had direct responsibilities in the past for energy and related portfolios. What are your immediate thoughts on the government's announcements?
Well, they're fanciful, Dan. This is not a target that I think is realisable without a really significant intervention in the economy, which would be a wrecking ball through the economy. And put it in perspective. Since Labor's come to power, there's been no material reduction in emissions. They're still sitting on about 28% down from 2005 levels. All of a sudden, miraculously, they're going to get to the pre-existing target of over 40%, 43% by 2030. That's 4 years away, but over 4 years away. And then they're suddenly going to get to 62 to 70%. Now, it is not in line with what we've seen over the recent past that would be achievable. And so the reality is anything's achievable. I mean, you can stop the economy and that'll stop emissions. But the question is, what are the consequences of that? Now, if you look deep in their report, you will see that they have modelled what they need to do as a carbon tax. They call it a marginal abatement incentive. They come up with all these weird and wonderful names, target consistent carbon value and all these things. But it's a carbon tax. It's a carbon tax. Yep. And that carbon tax gets up to around $300 a tonne. That's about 13 times Julia Gillard's carbon tax, should I say, that we fought against in the 2013 election. That's how I came into politics, on the back of that very successful campaign from Tony Abbott. And that will drive into everything we buy and businesses buy across the country. So you'll see it in food prices, you'll see it in building material prices, the price of a construction of a house, and therefore the cost of housing, the cost of transport, heavy vehicles, no doubt. There's lots of talk about how they're going to effectively impose this tax on heavy vehicles. The price of buying a vehicle, the most popular vehicles in Australia, already there's a tax mechanism in place. And they're going to ramp that up, no doubt, the Hilux and the Ranger, which are the two most popular cars in Australia. And, of course, the price of electricity. So we're all going to pay for this. They've not been honest about how those costs will flow through and how much everyone is going to have to pay. But they've been surprisingly honest about what the cause of those price increases is going to be. And it'll be our job to hold them to account on this. But this is a completely unacceptable target. I think it's a good thing that we very quickly, within a very short period of time, opposed it outright, and that's been a consensus across the leadership of the party.
Did you understand what they were saying in relation to diesel? Because it seemed to me they wanted to phase out diesel. That has obviously huge implications for primary industry, but also for defence, which uses that as the fuel that powers our armed forces, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, they're investing some R&D in biodiesel. That's fine. We've had biofuels for a long time, and investment in that is sort of R&D that governments do. But it is clear they want to go far further than that. And if they do that, what they're effectively going to have to do is put a tax on traditional diesel, which is the model for doing these things that governments tend to follow nowadays. That's effectively a carbon tax. And that will have an impact across all of the transport industry, of course, and particularly farming, mining. The other point to note about this is that they are also talking explicitly, and the Productivity Commission has driven them to this, about putting a carbon tax into our road user charging, which vehicles pay for, particularly heavy vehicles pay for, the big vehicles on the roads that carry all of our goods, and that will be another cost that flows through to the economy. So, look, what they've got is a whole series of processes in place to work up these schemes. They're sneaky carbon prices. Now, they don't do a sort of a carbon price across the economy. They do a whole series of these sneaky carbon prices. They give them lovely names like the vehicle emission standards and the safeguard, but what they're doing is ramping up a carbon tax. And we should oppose this. It's bad policy. It's bad for Australians. It'll be like a wrecking ball through our economy. It'll reduce our standard of living. And our job will be to convince the Australian people that this is not what they should be accepting.
The issue of net zero has become a totemic issue amongst the centre-right. All mainland divisions of the Liberal and National parties in Australia have now voted against net zero, some almost unanimously. Where do you stand? And is it tenable for elected representatives to continue with a policy when their members are so implacably opposed?
Well, look, I'm a member of the leadership. We're going through a review process, and I'm not going to preempt the outcome of that. But I will say this: back in 2021 and 2022, when this was a hot topic, it isn't so much in international circles anymore. It's much more about the 2035 targets that we've just been talking about. That's going to be the focus of the upcoming COP. But when this was being talked about a lot, my position and indeed the party's position was that we shouldn't be pursuing a target that's going to impose a cost on the Australian economy, and we should be focusing on choices that people make on clean energy technologies which they want to make because it's good for them. And that's long been my position. If someone wants to put solar on the roof, I don't think we should ban them. I think they should be free to do that as long as it's not imposing costs, unnecessary costs on everybody else. If someone wants to buy one of Elon Musk's Teslas, go for your life, knock yourself out, go for it. Or a hybrid, which actually, is probably one of the most efficient ways of reducing emissions, but you reduce your costs in the process. So, we shouldn't object to clean energy technologies. And I think the real issue is about what would the pathway to net zero be? If it's through choice by consumers and businesses of technologies which are good for them, as a Liberal, I think the Liberal Party is not just a conservative party, it's a freedom party. We believe in freedom of choice, so that's fine. If, on the other hand, what we're going to do is impose an effective carbon price or carbon tax or a series of sneaky carbon taxes as the government is pursuing right now, well, I've got a problem with that. And the Liberal Party has had a problem with that for a long time, and I think we've made that clear over the last 24 hours. We have a problem with that with the 2035 targets.
But obviously you should be able to import, whatever renewable type of technology, an EV or solar panels for your car. But isn't the whole point of net zero that it is imposing a cost? It does favour particular.
It can. There's no doubt about that. I mean, if you use it that way, then it's going to impose a cost on the economy, and it's going to be have a big economic impact. As I said, I've always had a view. I'm a big believer in the power of technology. I know it can be disruptive. I know it can have some negative consequences, but it very often has very positive consequences too. And if it's based on choice, people choosing to adopt it because they like it, and Australians have always been great adopters of new technologies, it's great. As I say, knock yourself out. Fantastic. But where I have a problem is with the imposition of taxes. So we'll work through that review, Dan. It's important, and it's an important set of decisions we've got to make as a party. I think it was no coincidence we landed at a place when we last had this debate to focus on technology, not taxes, and I think there's a strong logic in that.
Can Australia have a broader, deeper industrial base if it continues with net zero obligations and other carbon restriction obligations?
If it results in an imposition, as I say, either explicit or sneaky implicit of a carbon tax on the aluminium sector, for instance, or on whether it's smelting or refining, or on the steel sector, I think it's going to be extremely hard for Australia to be competitive. To the extent that we are able to be competitive, it may be because they've imposed tariffs And one of the interesting things about this report is carbon border adjustments are absolutely on the table. They're coming in Europe on the 1st of January. Everyone's talking about Trump's tariffs. But there's a very big set of tariffs, and indeed in some sectors bigger than Trump's tariffs, are coming from the Europeans right now in carbon border adjustments. So, if that's where Labor wants to go, they should be upfront about that because everyone will have to pay for that. But my own view is if we want to have a successful manufacturing sector in this country, and I've worked in that sector for many years before politics. I worked in the aluminium sector, smelting and refining. I worked in the steel sector and other mining and processing sectors, and I know them well. If you want to be successful there, you've got to get the fundamentals right, which Australia traditionally did. You've got to have low energy costs, which means don't impose unnecessary costs in our energy system, which is what we were just talking about. You've got to have a good approval system to get things built. You can't have construction costs that are out of line with the rest of the world, and we do right now. So getting those basics right is the key. If you don't get the basics right and you're asking for governments to subsidise or intervene to keep your industrial sector alive, you get into a pretty desperate situation. And I fear that's where we're going under Labor. We're continuing to see our industrial sector close, and we're hearing lots of really critical pieces of the industrial sector or factories and processing facilities just talking about leaving the country. I think that would be a very bad thing, but that's what happens when you don't get the fundamentals right.
Yeah. Do you think, though, that these smelters, and I'm very interested in it because obviously in Queensland there's a lot of discussion regarding the future status of Glencore, but there's smelting refineries across Australia. And it's significant, and I've chatted with Susie McDonald about this, because, at the moment we have 5% of the economy more or less devoted to manufacturing. But if we lose those smelters, that goes down to back of the envelope, 4 or 3%. That's sub-Saharan African levels of industrial complexity, right? So something, how do you turn that around? That's just not, I just don't feel that, at least from a defense perspective, that you can't have a credible defense force without a much more significant, broader industrial base to support what you need going forward, right?
Yeah, well, you need some bits of it. There's other bits probably less important. I mean, you obviously need fuel, and that's something we can talk about. But aluminium, over a longer period, you need it, of course, whether you can get it through allies. But look, the truth is that if you get the settings wrong, you will lose these facilities. The cost of construction in Australia is many times what it is in Indonesia or Singapore or China. As I say, I spent much of my pre-political career working in these sectors, helping them to be competitive. And I know that it's energy costs, it's construction costs, it's good industrial relations, it's approvals, good, sensible, light touch government regulation rather than imposing a whole lot of costs through government regulation. They're the things that make it possible to succeed. And even then, it's tough. I mean, we should be realistic. The service sector in our country has grown much faster than demand for industrial goods, and that's what happens as your economy gets wealthier. That happens in every country in the world. But the loss of our industrial sector has extended well beyond that, and I think that is a concern. It's a concern for defence. I mean, I note that in the latest Defence Corporate Plan, there's a really strong focus on, right at the top of the list, on net zero for our defence force. I mean, come on, this is, our defence force should focus first and foremost on being in a position to win wars. That has to be its first and primary goal. And that's because by being in a position to win wars, you deter them in the first place. That's how peace comes about. But to make emissions reduction the top of the list, I mean, seriously, and they're a tiny part of our overall emissions. So we've got to get our priorities right on this stuff.
Do you think, though, trade policy needs to be reassessed? I mean, that is what has happened in the States. And the point I always make to people, friends on the center right is that Ohio has nuclear power. Ohio has much more flexible labor relations than we could probably ever hope for. Ohio has lower taxes. And yet, and still, over the last 30 years, factories moved from there to China because they could ship all the goods back into the US market, close to duty free. Don't we need to reassess our trade policy at some level as well?
Well, I'm not a big believer in tariffs. I don't think they're the right way through, because at the end of the day, we consumers pay for it. I mean, it's a tax which is paid for primarily by consumers, and I don't think opposing an increase in the cost of living on consumers is a good idea. But the US example is an interesting one, right? So you are absolutely right. If you look at the US steel industry, for instance, we saw many of the big old traditional blast furnace-based steel operators running into trouble over many decades, in fact. We did see, by the way, a flowering of new technology, mini-mill type technology developing in the United States, which has been very successful. And BlueScope, one of our two remaining steel companies in this country, upstream steel at least, has been very successful using that technology in the United States. And we have seen a flowering of a lot of manufacturing in the United States on the back of low gas prices. It's been really, in the fertilizer industry and other related industries, we've seen extraordinary growth because they've been able to get gas out from under the ground. And whilst a significant amount of that is now being exported, they're competitive with us in terms of their volumes exported. In fact, I think they're ahead of us now. They've also had a great deal for their domestic industry, and that has had a huge impact. And so much more significant than any other policy could have. So I think if you get these fundamentals right, you can really make a difference. But we haven't had the fundamentals right. We need to get them right. And I think that should be a priority for government.
Just to push on this point a little bit more, because I mean, I always say to people on the center right, they always think that John Howard recently said, tariffs are not conservative, and I always say, well, hang on, Benjamin Disraeli was skeptical about free trade. Every president on Mount Rushmore was in favor of tariffs. Robert Gordon Menzies was in favor of tariffs. Alexander Hamilton, pretty bright guy, was in favor of tariffs. Were they simply all wrong? Or isn't the situation that you're talking about restructuring a tax system so you have lower direct taxes, but a broader, border tax around the economy? Because we did introduce a lot of taxes in the much lauded, Hawke, Keating, Howard era with capital gains tax, fringe benefits tax, GST, and all the rest of it. And yet we have this doctrinaire approach to saying no taxes on goods crossing the international border. Doesn't that need to be recalibrated?
Well, we do have a tax on all goods, which is the GST. I mean, and it doesn't discriminate between imports and domestic. I know the US tried to make something of this and saying we've got an effective tariff. It's not. It's a non-discriminatory GST. So I mean that's kind of we've already got that. But your point about history is really important, and it is absolutely right. I mean, you're stating the facts, but there's something missed in that argument, and I've been intrigued watching this argument in the United States. The reason there was such a focus on tariffs in those days is administratively that was a simple tax. An income tax or even a GST type tax was not something that their administrative system could easily handle. And so what you saw over time is an evolution and change of the tax base as it became administratively possible to tax income and broader goods and services consumption across the economy. So, that's the evolution. That's the history of it. So that doesn't, just because that was the approach they took then, we do have a very different environment now where administratively we can tax in many different ways. There's a really important question about the best way to do it. That's been a debate that sort of runs in economic circles and in other circles and should do for a long time. My general starting point is I want lower taxes then. As a Liberal, I believe in lower taxes, and that means you've got to manage government spending carefully and you've got to grow the economy. And those two things ensure you've got your best shot at lower taxes, and that should always be our focus.
What have you learnt about the defence industry that you did not know before taking over the shadow ministerial responsibilities?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a couple of things I would say about that. And I came in as someone who was always interested in defence and watched the debates very
Mm.
closely, and I had some involvement with parts of defence through my role in cybersecurity and law enforcement and so on. But I guess you come into this role and you get much deeper in it and you roll your sleeves up. There's a couple of things I would say that I think I've learned. The first is that the threat environment is much more serious than I had realised. I knew it would got more serious, make no mistake about it, but I hadn't realised how serious it was. The Chinese Communist Party is militarising at a rate we have never seen before. Its military ambitions are very, very clear. It wants to have a much more significant military force. It is seeking to influence right across our region. We've seen it, some of that influence, albeit indirect, in the South Pacific just in the last week, where Albanese thought he had deals lined up with Vanuatu and PNG, and all of a sudden they disappeared. Lots of questions as to why, but what's clear is the Chinese Communist Party is seeking to exert enormous influence across the South Pacific. But more generally, I think they're seeking to use both soft power and, of course, the potential of hard power as a way of getting their way and having more influence across the region. Now, many might say, well, that doesn't matter to Australia. We're a long way from all of this. No one's ever going to invade us. I don't think that's correct. I think we've got facilities here that would be of great interest to the PLA and the Chinese Communist Party in a conflict. But what I would also say is that in the event that there is at least grey zone conflict, as it's called, which is cyber and electronic warfare and these sorts of softer things, extending all the way through to a genuine conflict, the impact on us could be enormous. The impact on trade, the impact on access to the critical goods and services that we need to survive. I mean, we saw little things during COVID, like access to chips. Right? I mean, that turns out to have had an impact none of us anticipated. I saw, as energy minister, access to AdBlue. I mean, what's AdBlue? AdBlue is this additive you put into your diesel to reduce emissions, that if without it, engines stop. And so we had to work out how to get AdBlue manufactured in Australia, and we did. It was something I did over Christmas and New Year of 21, 22. I didn't get much of a break, because if we hadn't got that right, everything would have stopped. So, these conflicts, soft or hard, can really impact our lives. And that's become very, very apparent to me. The other thing that's become apparent is our military is not funded to the level it needs to be able to deal with this conflict. And in funding it properly, we've also got to recognise that there's an extraordinary change happening in military technology across the world. The use of drones, the use of missile and counter-missile capability. We've seen it in the Middle East. We've seen it, of course, in the Ukraine, and we have to get serious about this. This is well suited to us as a smaller country, by the way, and we should absolutely be going down this path. But we are moving too slowly, and we need to get on this train fast.
Yeah, what do you say, though, to double back on the trade policy point, to someone like J.D. Vance, who had that pithy line that the worst possible foreign policy would be for China to make all our stuff and to go to war with China.
Yeah.
But if it isn't the sort of the posture that we have in Australia, we get very serious about the Chinese threat, but we're happy to have China make our razors and our boots and God knows everything else.
Yeah. So, again, great question. But you've got to be selective. If we said, look, from tomorrow, we're going to make everything in Australia, I'm just, taking the extreme there so that people can understand. The cost of everything would go way up. Our cost of living, our standard of living would collapse quite dramatically. I can't give you the numbers. What I do know is it would be a very big impact, So you can't, we're not about to do that, and we shouldn't do that, because people won't accept that kind of hit to their standard of living. But what I think we can do, and what I sought to do when I was in the energy and then later in the industry role was to pick those sectors where you are seriously vulnerable. One of those, it turns out, was AdBlue. I mean, this is it's actually fertilizer, high purity fertilizer, it turns out, and we were able to divert one of our local fertilizer manufacturing facilities to solve that problem. And that was a really good thing for us to do. I saved the final 2 refineries in Australia. If we hadn't have intervened, they would have gone, petroleum refineries. That was a really important piece of work. It's cost, by the way, the taxpayer very little to do that because of the way we structured that deal based on, my history outside of politics. We were able to put that together, get the 2 companies involved, which was Viva and Ampol, and we got a really good outcome for them and for us. So I think you can do this in a targeted, selective way. There will always be a reasonable debate about how broad that needs to be. And that's an important debate to have. And it's happening in the US too, with chips, for instance, which is one I mentioned earlier, and how much of that you can rely on your allies for. I mean, we're never going to have the depth of economy and specialization that the United States is capable of in high tech areas and so on. And so this is where alliances really matter. And I guess that's the other point I would say I've learned in this role is just how important these alliances are and how much work and investment you have to put into them to maintain them, to strengthen them, and to keep people positive and trusting in those alliances.
Yeah. I must say, as you may know, I was at this National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C. at the beginning of this month. I was the only Australian there, and I was surprised that the embassy, which was 15 minutes walk down the road, didn't send someone along, because you had incredible access to senior administration officials and their staffers and a whole lot of other influential kind of people that you could have formed bonds or found out different things. And I thought, well, hang on, why wasn't the ABC there as well? That clearly is a four corners mano in Washington, D.C. Shouldn't they, if they're genuinely interested in finding out what's making the new administration tick, they should be here. One other thing I might ask you
Can I
about.
just make a comment on that? Because I think it's a really interesting point, if I may, Dan. Amongst some circles, there's this allergy to the Trump administration. As though it's not legitimate. I mean, it's a legitimately elected, democratically elected government. And I think people should be respecting that. And this is incredibly important. They are a really crucial ally to us. They have underpinned and underwritten peace in our part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, since the Second World War. And for us not to be doing everything we can to nurture that relationship and strengthen it. For Anthony Albanese to have met 3 times with the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi, and not to have met face-to-face with the president, the leader of the free world, Donald Trump, to me is just extraordinary. And we've got to get over this, for some, seems to me to be Trump derangement syndrome. He is the president of the United States. If you like him or don't like him, respect him as the president of the United States.
At least push past the individual too, because there's a lot of interesting policy changes that are going on, which are separate from the individual in question. Just changing tack slightly. You've had an incredibly impressive academic and professional career before entering politics. Among other things, you're a Rhodes Scholar and studied at Oxford. In the last week, the president of the Oxford Union, which is arguably the most prestigious debating society in the world, appeared to celebrate on social media the murder of Charlie Kirk, who he had recently met and debated in person. Amongst other things, this seems like an obvious example of decline in our education and cultural institutions, which I don't think is confined to the UK. What do you think has caused that, and what can realistically be done to address it?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan, and I think that's incredibly disappointing. I think, Charlie Kirk, of course, was a true champion of free speech and debate and the importance of debate, which is what the Oxford Society is all about. And to then decry that kind of work that Charlie Kirk did all of those years. I never met him, but extraordinary focus on something that really matters, which is disagreeing well. He believed in disagreeing well. And lots of people disagreed with him, but the debate is really important. So I think it's incredibly disappointing when our academic institutions, where debate matters more than anywhere else, because that's where the biggest thinking should be happening for what the future of our countries and our world looks like. If we can't debate freely and well, we've got a really big problem. How we got to this, it's a great question. I worry about it enormously. I've been privileged to go to extraordinary institutions in my time at university, Sydney University, and then on to an honours streams there, and but economic school and law school, and then on to Oxford, and I've taught at some great institutions as well, and I worry deeply about. We have to do better, whatever the cause. We have to do better, and I think that what happened to Charlie Kirk is incredibly sad, and sad not just for him and his family, of course that's tragic, but also for the world, that we haven't been able to debate in the way that Charlie Kirk wanted us to be able to debate.
Yeah. Yeah, I just there have always been radicals at university, but this seems to have taken it to another level where the head of like I said, probably the most prestigious debating society in the world doesn't understand that should be able to disagree with someone without thinking they should be murdered. Changing tack again slightly, there was a large-scale anti-mass immigration, so-called March for Australia protest in Australia on the 31st of August. There's another March for Australia protest planned for the 19th of October. There were neo-Nazis, which were platformed, as I understand, in Sydney and Melbourne, but there were no neo-Nazis at the march in Brisbane, and the organisers here have guaranteed there will be none on the 19th of October. Mass immigration is a legitimate issue, not only in Australia, but across the Western world. Should a representative of the Liberal or National parties attend the march in Brisbane?
Oh, look, that's up to individuals, but I tell you what, we should be participating in a debate about the right level of immigration in this country in a way that's respectful to immigrants. I mean, we are a great immigrant nation, and I'm very proud of that. Of course, that's most of us, one way or another, immigrants a few generations back or less, and that's a great thing. But that is different from the debate about what is the right level of immigration in this country. And when Labor got up to close to 600,000 in a year, I mean, that's over 500,000 in a single year. I mean, this is not a number this country can absorb, has ever had to in the past, by the way. I mean, it's way beyond anything we've ever seen before, and it's way out of line with what even other countries are seeing. There is a rate of immigration that is manageable and can be absorbed in terms of housing, in terms of other infrastructure, and more generally in terms of our communities. And clearly, over 500,000 is way too high. Now, even the government thinks this. The trouble is, it keeps missing its targets. That's how bad it's got. It keeps coming in over what it says it's going to be. And we've got to get this balance right. It's not right. I respect the fact that there are many people in Australia who believe that strongly and who are prepared to march on it, and we should all respect that. It's unfortunate that others who seem to have other issues they want to focus on want to platform themselves in these sorts of marches, and I'm really delighted to hear, by the way, the organisers are making sure that doesn't happen in future. But it doesn't take away. It doesn't take away from the fact that this is. This is one of those debates. We're just talking about debating. That really must happen. And Australians have got to be honest with each other about it and frank about it. Respectful. We should always be in debate. But I think we can have those respectful debates.
There has been an enormous increase in house prices and other asset prices for some time, but particularly during the COVID era with the monetary stimulus that came along, and it's also driven by immigration. Many young people think that's unfair. There was a policy motion by the Vaucluse Young Liberals, which you probably know about, which proposed to introduce an inheritance tax while at the same time reducing income taxes. I object to inheritance taxes coming from Queensland when we abolished them back in the day. But what should be done to address the widening divide between those who own assets that tend to be older Australians and those who do not, who tend to be younger?
Yeah, no, great question. And we definitely have a degree of intergenerational conflict going on where younger Australians feel that they're poorer than they should be and that some of that wealth resides with the older generations, particularly the boomer generation. And that conflict is not a healthy one. I think part of it is we have a sense in the community, particularly amongst a lot of younger Australians, that the economy is now zero sum. There's no, it's not growing. And so we're just dividing up the pie now. And if we're going to divide up the pie, you should have less and I should have more. That's where it's come to. That's really sad in my view. That is a
Mm.
terrible, terrible outcome. So the first and most important thing is we know economic growth drives economic dynamism and economic opportunity, and people being able to realize aspirations. It is so important that our economy is able to grow, not through just people, which is immigration and to a much lesser extent natural population growth, but through just being a more productive economy with more wealth that people can tap into if they work hard and have a real crack. So that to me is incredibly important, and losing trust in that is something we should all worry about deeply. After 3 years of Labor, where most quarters, certainly the majority of quarters since they've been in power, GDP per person hasn't gone forward. Population is growing faster than the economy. I mean, that's
Mhm.
just no wonder we've got a younger generation who just saying we just got to divide up the pie because it's not getting any bigger. But there's also, I think, when it comes to housing, which was your question, we've got to get the balance right. If you've got 550,000 people coming into the country in a single year, your housing supply will not keep up and has not kept up. This is absolutely I don't think you solve this problem by redistribution and wealth taxes. I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is more housing,
I think the answer is more housing.
and getting the balance between immigration and housing, population growth and housing right, and it's not right at the moment.
The poll numbers for the Liberal Party and Liberal National Party uh, among young people are dismal at the moment. Why do you think that is, and what can be done to improve the appeal of the centre right amongst the young people?
Yeah, no, it's a great question again. And look, they are poor and they need to improve, and we need to find ways to do that. I do think a big part of this is people have lost trust in a dynamic economy where opportunity comes because the economy is strong and effective. We have relied on that for a long while. It's been central to our offering that if you have a Liberal government, the economy will be stronger, it'll be more robust, it'll be more dynamic, and with that comes more opportunity. And anyone who's aspirational then should support us. And if you've got economic situation where we're not going forward on a per person basis, then it's not surprising that people turn to the party of taking from one to give to another. And that's exactly what they've done. It's exactly what they've done. So I think this is where many on our side of politics think economic policy is less important than it used to be. I think it's more important than it used to be. I mean, I think we shouldn't stop at economic policy. There's many other areas of policy that really matter as well. But it is really important if we're to have a younger generation that are engaged, that are hopeful, that are trusting, and that believe they can get ahead because they can get ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the economics is very important. Peter Dutton in the last lead up to the last federal election uh, wanted to avoid culture war, so-called culture war issues,
Hmm.
because he said that's what people weren't concerned about. Were concerned about economics above all. Do you share that view? And as a follow up, what is a woman? Because that was the
Well,
question. That was the question
a,
he
a
he
woman's a
wanted to
biological
answer.
female, but
Okay,
in,
yeah.
in answer to your earlier question, I think culture does matter, but it's the issues that we focus on there have to be issues that matter to, the broader Australian population. If they're niche issues and we get caught up on them, many Australians will say, "Oh no, that doesn't matter to me." But the fact that we need a really good education system that gets back to basics, that teaches kids, those reading and writing and arithmetic, and is not just some platform for indoctrination. I mean, that really matters to people, and it doesn't just matter to parents; it matters to grandparents and others who are worried about our education system. I think that is incredibly important, and it's cultural, it's economic, it's social. There's a lot of aspects to education, of course, but I think those things really count, and I don't think we should shy away from them when many Australians are affected by them. At the end of the day, we're part of a democracy. We've got to focus on the things that a broad sweep of people in the country care about. But I think there's lots of issues that do have cultural implications that we should care about. I think the economy is actually not just an economic issue. I think it's also a cultural issue. If you lose aspiration, if you lose hope, if you lose trust in the way your economy works because you think you can't get ahead, if you believe that you've been disempowered because the economy is not working for you, if resentment is breeding around that, that is deeply cultural. It is deeply cultural, and it would mean a loss of trust between Australians and their country. And if that deteriorates enough, it can have really terrible adverse circumstances or consequences, at least.
What do you think explains then the dramatic changes on the centre right we've seen across the Anglosphere? Parties like the Conservative Party of Britain, which are really in terminal decline, the Republican Party, which has been transformed, parties across Europe, which have been, completely upended. We haven't seen that here in Australia. So what explains it there, and what explains why we haven't seen it here?
Well, I think we have seen. I think we have seen disruption here. Whether you've seen enough change, which I think is what you're referring about, is a fair question. Look, I think there's three things that drive it. The first is we're seeing a change in the structure of our economy. I mean, we're seeing a shift away, as you've described earlier on in this podcast, from a traditional industrial economy, which is where I came from farming family and working in manufacturing and mining, that sort of tangible side of the economy. We've seen a decline in that and a growth in service and the knowledge economy. And that has deep cultural implications as well as economic ones. And it's a challenge for us. We tended to be the party of the aspirational in an industrial economy. So that, that's a big change. The second big change is I think we have seen a decline in Christianity. I wouldn't say we've seen a complete decline in religion. I mean, I have a significant population of immigrants in my electorate who are very religious, and on social issues, they're very, very conservative, by the way. But we've definitely seen a decline in Christianity. I think that's having an impact. And I think the third thing is we've seen the rise of social media. And I don't think which has been extraordinary, and the decline of the mass media that's come with that. I don't think centre-right parties across the world have always reconciled themselves with those changes as well as we could have. And I think, that is a really big deal for us. There's a whole lot of implications of those three changes that really matter for how we engage with people. It doesn't mean giving up on our core values of being a freedom party, of being a party that believes in conserving our key institutions like the family, a patriotic party that believes in standing in front of one flag and not many. These things I think we can still hold true to, and we should. We absolutely should. But we've got to recognise that there's a group of people who've become very dissatisfied with those changes that are going on around them, we need to make sure that we are a party that satisfies them, or at least gets them to vote for us because we're standing for them, most importantly, and at the same time recognises these changes that are happening around us.
You've mentioned several times you're from a farming family. I have a bit of pedigree there too. And granted, it's a smaller portion of the population that are involved in that life that once were, but it can be a very rewarding life. and I believe you've got a brother who's still a farmer, right? How do we make it more attractive proposition for families to work in rural communities or to take up farming life?
Well, I've got two brothers who are full-time farmers, and yeah, I've got a farm outside these doors too, which I look after when I get a moment. And so, I love it. I grew up with it, and it's very hard to get it out of your veins if you grew up with it, participated in it for much of my life. Um, but I think it is attractive. It's interesting that you raise this. I think it's incredibly attractive, and it's been good to many Australians. The farming sector. It's obviously become more efficient over time, and that's one of the reasons why uh, Australia's been so successful in agriculture, and that means that there's less people involved in it, certainly as a proportion of the economy and all of that. But I would say to anyone who's in farming or wants to get into farming, it's a fantastic career, and there's lots of opportunity. It's got a beautiful combination of you know interesting things happening, new technologies always emerging, but you know you're outside and you're in the elements and you're dealing with animals and exciting things that are happening. It can be tough. Drought's tough. Low commodity prices are tough. I would say my observation over the years is that it's more attractive for people to go into farming when it's more prosperous and less attractive when it's less prosperous. And I was in a generation through the 90s, which was pretty tough, particularly for livestock agriculture, which is where I came from. It's been better in recent years than it was, and you see the attractiveness is affected by that. So we've got to help it to be productive and effective and prosperous if we're going to keep attracting good people to it.
But I believe in a separate conversation you mentioned once that your brother wasn't finding it as much fun as it once was.
Yeah.
So is what can be done to make it fun again? Because I can imagine
Yeah.
there's quite a few people in their small little dog box apartment in Sydney that have the wild erratic fancy of thinking flicking through the Instagram feeds of people who I don't know display obviously an unreal version of farming and think that possibly could be for me. Um, how's
So
it going to be fun?
yeah, and
Yeah.
my point that when I said that, I've said that many times, is that what you have seen in farming in recent decades is government getting way more involved. Government telling farmers how to run their farms. Government overlaying farmers with bureaucracy in so many different parts of what they do. And there's a lot of farmers now feel as though they're spending more time dealing with government than they are dealing with farming, and the things you have to do to be a good farmer. You shouldn't have to be an expert in government and a lawyer to be able to be a farmer, but many feel as though that's what's happening to them. Now, this is not just farming. You see this right across small business, which is one of those great institutions. I talked about the importance of conserving important institutions should be in the DNA of the Liberal Party. Small business and farming absolutely right at the heart of that. So I think the role of government has been really important in a negative way, sadly, in making life harder for our farmers and our small business people more generally. And I think we've got to try and lighten that load.
Yeah, I think it would appeal to many people more than you think if there was a path for them to get out there somehow, albeit everyone has to be realistic about how tough and it really is. Final couple of questions. So what pillars of the Howard era, which is always held up as the gold standard amongst Liberal politicians, what pillars of that policy framework do you think no longer make sense?
Well, I'll start with what I think still does make sense, which is that the Liberal Party needs to combine being the Freedom Party with the Conservative Party, conserving our key institutions. And I think whilst that balance comes into tension at times, I think they are two things that live together in a really important way. Freedom of speech and freedom to do business, which is what we were just talking about, along with conserving critical institutions like small business, like family, which I still think is, one of the most important, probably the most important institution to bringing up kids well and giving people great opportunity and building aspirations. So John Howard always like to describe the party as having to have those two rails, Burke and Mill, the two great political philosophers. And I think that's absolutely right. But lots has changed too. I mean, the way you engage with people has changed. I talked earlier about the Liberal Party or centre-right parties across the world, conservative parties, having to reconcile themselves with the change in the media environment. I don't think we've done that as well as we need to, and we need to do way better on that. I mean, podcasting is a good example. It's just exploded. And I've made a big effort to do lots of podcasts over the last year or so. But this is people, despite the fact that so much of what we do is short form, all of a sudden they've discovered these long form formats, which people really love, right? So we have to do much better at that. That is incredibly important to us. I think we've also got to build a grassroots movement again. We've lost that grassroots of the Liberal Party that Menzies built through the 40s and the 50s, which was incredibly powerful. And we see that in the numbers of members which have fallen. And then more generally on policy, we've got to be solving the problems of today, not yesterday. But there's a lot of commonality, by the way, getting to an economy that grows, that offers opportunity and aspiration. I'm not sure that the fundamentals are as different as some would argue from Howard's time as they are now. But these are all still important things.
Yeah, it just strikes me in the States there has been much more of a divide between the George W. Bush era and obviously the Trump era, and who knows what will flow through in Australia in due course. On that point, and a final question, Angus, what do you think are the top 3 policy issues that will define the next federal election?
Well, I'm guessing at this point, because lots can happen in 2.5 years or whatever it's going to be, a couple of years. And the thing about politics is it can change incredibly fast. But if I was to guess, I still think energy policy is going to be right at the heart of it. If Labor wants to impose sneaky carbon taxes across our economy with unrealistic targets, that'll be a wrecking ball through our economy, through aspiration, through household standard of living. I think that's a really big deal. I think more generally on the economy, who can get it moving again to deal with the issues that we were talking about earlier. I think that really counts. I think there's a very real chance that getting the balance right on immigration could be a big issue going into the next election, and I think that's something, and combined with housing, that will continue to be a debate in this country, and should be, because we've got to get the balance right on these things. Young Australians want to get into a house, and it's really important, and we've got to have the right balance in immigration. So all of those are important. In my own portfolio area, we are seeing the Chinese Communist Party increasingly flex its muscle, and other authoritarian regimes around the globe. I mean, we've seen this with Iran. We've seen it with Russia. We've seen it, of course, with the Chinese Communist Party. They are flexing their muscles in ways that they haven't for a long, long time. They perceive weakness in their Western adversaries. And that's something that, frankly, we've got to be able to deal with, and that does mean spending more on our better funding our defence force, and it does mean putting ourselves in a position where we're not seeking conflict, we're seeking peace, but strength is the key to deterrence and peace, and I think that will continue to be a big issue in the coming years.
Angus Taylor, really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on.
Great to be with you, Dan.
Cheers, bye.